The Spinosaurus paper is out with Spinosaurus mirabilis, and I'm going to take a deeper dive into the postcranial evidence. There's not as much as you think, and yet this will go longer than you suspect. I'm Dr. Brian Curtis with Fossil Crates, and I'm a sauropod tail expert, or at least by choice, but today I've been poking around Spinosaurus, and I have no preconceived notions. I have no dog in this fight. I got my popcorn out like most of you. But I wanted to understand the paper, so I unpacked the postcranial elements as best I could. I want to alert you now that this video is long and it gets very detailed and complex. And the reason is because I wanted you to see how I read a paper of something. I'm not an expert on this area. I'm a sauropod specialist, especially in the tail region, but vertebrae in general. And I read this paper very carefully and thoughtfully, and I have a lot of thoughts. And I'm going to walk you through the importance of locality information, specimen numbers, and some of the areas I tripped or stumbled on while reading this paper. I enjoyed the paper immensely. I look forward to the next follow-up rounds from both camps, but let's jump right in. I'm going to point out that there's two major site locations, Jenguebi and Iguidi. And of the two, they're quite a few hundred miles apart. And then within the Jenguebi site, they have 9 sublocales. And within the Iguidi fossil area, they have over 40, or at least 40. And I've discovered that they were working this site in the early 2000s, or the early aughts as well. That was news to me. They made the holotype cranial elements. Of course they did. And they used 5 bones. And I'll do another deep dive into the cranial aspects of this animal soon, very soon. But in the interim, let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing that I'm curious about, I'll show this chart here. This is their fossil area. What I can't figure out is they have this table S1, which is my go-to table throughout this conversation. But it has D, dorsal vertebra, MNBH. I'm reading it here. What does that mean? I don't know. So if any of you know, if you could let me know, that'd be great. So I made table S1 my source of truth, and S stands for supplement. It's in the supplemental section. And then I further broke it down, removing all of the cranial elements. So now what we're looking at here is just the axial and appendicular skeleton, excluding skull. And I'll just go start off with Gen 9, and I'll just use the nicknames for Jenguebi, MNBH, JEN9. I'll just call it Gen 9. And Gen 9 is clearly an anterior caudal vertebra. And they figure it on the skeleton, and they show a picture of it, and they show the cross-section, and they show the classic big caudal ribs. They also mention a partial chevron is there. They don't figure it anywhere. They don't show it, but they do score it in the cladogram, which I thought was interesting. I really would like to have seen it, but I like tails, so of course I'm starting with the tail. That's the only bone that they list for Gen 9. Gen 8 shows a lone dorsal posterium with the base of the spine in 2 pieces, and I'm not sure which one that is entirely. So after Gen 8 produced a lone posterior dorsal centrum with the base of the spine in 2 pieces, they list Gen 7, which comes with what they're calling dorsal 3 partial centrum and base of neural arch. It's the only one that further says isolated. I don't know what that means, but something to keep in mind. Now Gen 2 is where it gets exciting because they list a partial anterior mid-cervical, but they don't seem to figure that anywhere. They also say Gen 2 produced a mid-posterior dorsal, and they put an illustration that suggests this neural spine chunk that has these grooves goes with the centrum. And now that neural spine chunk is important because it allows them to know that this had a tall spine because it's very similar in thickness and height. You can see that cross-section of that specimen. It's not clear to where this figure 3C. Does it go with the figure 3D? Does it go, which one is it? I'm not sure, it's not clear. Gen 8 does list 2 pieces of a spine and the posterior dorsal centrum. So is this actually Gen 8 that we just talked about? I don't know. It's part of the frustration I have. I love this paper, but there's a little bit of tweaking I would have preferred they do to help me match all these together. Now, they also note from Gen 2 that it has a partial left ischium. And you can see it. They draw that little shaft of bone. And the blue is what I'm presuming is original. And because they don't provide a photo of it. But that's not a lot to go off of. They also say they have a partial proximal left femur. Now, when they say partial proximal, wow, they're really leaning in. It has 2 chunks of bone. Now, thankfully, these chunks of bone have trochanter attachments, so we know it's a femur, we know it's a left, and it allows us to do some scoring in the cladogram. But it's clearly their illustration later on 3G is a lot of restoration. That's the light white, and then the dark gray is the actual elements, which is confirmed by the blue on the skeleton. I do like that I can do visual comparisons between the two. Very cool. Now, Gen 4 produced a caudal vertebrae. It says posterior caudal vertebrae. They don't provide estimated positional numbers, and it's not shown on the skeleton. So I'm not sure what to tell you about that. Gen 4 also lists pedal phalanges in situ from the site. Alas, no figure and no additional detail. In situ is key because and pedal phalanges plural suggests to me that they've got part of a foot, but it doesn't show it. Now, I want to bring something to your attention. Figure 3, the skeleton has figure 3H. And within it, it says that tibia, which they show in 2 different views, as well as a beautiful cross-section showing the medullary cavity, they claim that is from Gen 2. However, Gen 2 is not in our S1 table. Gen 4 says it brought a tibia. And they also note in the paper they compare a tibia to a dennary, which is from Gen 4. So I suspect that's a typo, and I have verified that is a typo, that figure should have said from Gen 4. Now, apparently they do have a tibia from Gen 2 that's in jackets that is not in the United States yet, further adding to the confusion, but we didn't know about that till now. Now I know. Now they have multiple elements. I'm super excited to see what comes of it. You see these pictures here. You can overlay. The blue is what they found, I believe. And you see on this image, what I found funny was in this figure, they had this far right one with the blue triangle showing the articulation facet, and then the one next to it. It's the exact same. So I was curious why they used the images twice. They did this for 3 tibiae. But hey, not my paper. Who doesn't like to see images? What I do enjoy is figure S2 in the supplementary section shows the tibia in the ground. So it gives you a nice visual of what this looks like laying on the surface and why it's so important that we have people out looking and collecting. And that's it. That's all of your Jenguebi postcranial elements. Now we'll move to the other locality, a couple 100 miles away, called Iguidi. And they have 5 postcranial elements reported from Iguidi. The site IGU 25 has 2 articulated anterior dorsal centra. They call them D1 and D2. And what I found interesting about those is if you look at the skeleton, it appears that they've mounted it as cervical, the last cervical and D1. We'll go into the skeletal guesses here in a moment because I want to jump to IGU 11. This is a D1. They call it an anterior dorsal centrum. It appeared originally, and this shocked me, in Brusati and Serino 2007, where they named Carcharodontosaurus iguiadensis, and this was called a mid-cervical centrum at that time and referred to Carcharodontosaurus. McFeeters et al. In 2013 said, no, that goes to, how do I say this, Sigilmasaurus brevicalis. And then Serino et al. 2022 said, no, that's roughly a D1 of Spinosaurus, but we don't provide it a species. They do indicate they're thinking it could be a different species in that paper. And then in 2026, they say it's from the Farac Formation and it belongs to Spinosaurus mirabilis. So they're calling it a D1. They're showing its shape. They're showing some characters on it. There's this nice big figure that came from the Brusati and Serino 2007 paper of this vertebra. So you can compare and contrast it with the element that the image they put on their figure 3B. Pretty neat to see. IGU 39 produced a mid-caudal centrum with the base of the neural arch preserved. I can't tell if it's figured or not. I'm guessing maybe it is. And then they found at IGU 40 the pedal proximal phalanx 2-1. It's so cool that you can know exactly what phalanx you're looking at on these animals. And so that is shown in figure 3A and figure 3I. You can see it on the skeleton, and you can see this nice close-up. Figure 3 says there's a mid-caudal centrum from IGU 32. Let's go back to our source of truth. Table S1 doesn't list an IGU 32. I think they mean IGU 39. And I think that vert here that they put on the mount with these large neural spines drawn in and big caudal ribs is actually IGU 39. And if that's the case, then they've really leaned in on these giant tall spines because I don't have any evidence of it. But, you know, if you're presuming that's what it looks like, that's what you do. It does have caudal ribs. So what's interesting to me is I would not call this a mid-caudal centrum. By sauropod definition, if it has caudal ribs, that's still an anterior caudal vertebra. So maybe theropod folks have a difference of terminological opinion. Again, I'm studied this part of the tail in sauropods and certainly wouldn't call it a mid-caudal centrum. I wait for the caudal ribs to disappear. But that's me and that's my Sauro Squad folks. They did not score 103, 104, or 105, and that surprised me because all you need is the ventral surface. So that tells me the bottom of that vertebra must be distorted and marred, which you can't tell from the imagery here. That's why it's important to provide 6 views of every element of a photo. A scan's nice, but a photo is wonderful too. A CT scan being the best of both worlds. They scored 106 as a 1, and then 109 they claimed was a 1. And this one surprised me as well. I'm going to read it to you because it says it's the position of transition point of the caudofemoralis and ilioischiocaudalis muscles correlate. And that means in order to know that, they're assigning a spot to this vertebra. And they have chosen that this is caudal 15 through 19. How do you know the position of an isolated caudal vertebra on a new species? Now, maybe they're comparing it to that big gorgeous Spinosaurus aegyptiacus tail and they mashed it along and found its spot, and that's quite possible. But I was surprised that they did that. And then they scored 114. They said it's a middle and posterior neural spine, extends to the prezygote apophyses. Then they score what you'd think they would. The middle centrum length is a certain ratio, and the height and the view and anterior view is circular. And that's cool. But their character 117 and character 118 talks about a groove on the chevrons, but they don't show the chevrons. So I have no way to test their cladogram. And this is something I went through all of that belaborment on the tail to say that as a researcher who's trying to conduct research without going to the location itself, it is very challenging because I don't know, I can't corroborate their information. So that was fascinating to me. But these are experts in their field. Paul Sereno, clearly. Daniel Vidal is one of the best young scientists, up-and-comers out there. I've worked with him in multiple laboratories in Utah, in South Dakota, and in Colorado, and he's amazing. So I give these guys a benefit of the doubt wherever possible because there's only so much you can put in a paper too. This is a science paper. They'll probably write a larger paper downstream, some kind of monograph. But if you're trying to work from home on these quick pubs in Science and Nature, it can drive you rather to frustration quickly. There are a number of characters that they score different of Spinosaurus mirabilis versus Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. So I'm going to go through these characters because I found them fascinating. Character 158 is the astragalus ascending process. And we don't have an astragalus found, and yet they scored aegyptiacus a 2 while mirabilis got a 1. And it's because I'm assuming that shaded area on the tibia is receiving the astragalus. But at least in sauropods, you would never score this. So it surprised me that they were able to see a difference. Character 123, the marrow cavity, they score aegyptiacus a 1, meaning its marrow cavity is reduced or absent, while mirabilis is a 0, which means the marrow cavity is present. As an aside, they gave Oxalia a 1, matching it with aegyptiacus. So the text states that the tibia of mirabilis is proportionately longer with an open, albeit reduced, medullary cavity. So that's one of the characters that differentiates the two is medullary cavity. I don't know how good of a character that is personally because I study vertebrae, but it is interesting. I don't see that much in sauropods. Everything's solid, as is befitting something walking around tens of thousands of pounds. Character 92, they separate dorsal vertebrae, middle and posterior centra, pneumatic foramina, present or absent. Aegyptiacus was scored as present, as was Oxalia, while mirabilis was scored as mid and posterior dorsal centra lack pneumatic foramina. However, the text says it includes relatively large anterior dorsal pleurocoels. Now, the character's middle and posterior dorsals. So first of all, they have to know where within the dorsal column these vertebrae go in order to score that. And these are dealing with isolated vertebrae. In sauropods, that can be challenging. You can get the extremes identified, but those in the middle, it can get complex. I don't know how it is with Spinosaurus, but it does make me want to see the vertebrae in my hands. Now, character 88 is the dorsal vertebrae anterior centra pneumatic foramen size. Is smaller than the parapophysis for Aegyptiacus, or is larger or equal to the parapophysis in mirabilis. Now, one thing I know in sauropods is these characters, these lateral pneumatic foci, are absolutely variable. So that last character and this character make me extremely nervous if this was a sauropod cladogram. It's a theropod. I don't have the frame of reference, but to keep in mind, anything pneumatic should be flagged as variable. I would love a cladogram that allows me to have a variability score. So we could go from, say, 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, with pneumatic characters being a 4 or a 5 out of 5, and characters that don't move, like cranial nerve locations in most cases, are a 1. That would be super helpful because we could rerun the cladogram, excluding or limiting the weighted value of those characters, because they do have some value, potentially, but they shouldn't all be considered the same value. I know I'm way off topic here, but if you're staying with me this far, it's because you're interested in this stuff. Now, character 66 threw my software for a loop because it's the teeth, crown striations, flutes, and epicobasal ridges. Now, what they gave for Aegyptiacus is it's polymorphic. They gave it a 0 and a 1, whereas mirabilis got a 0, being absent. Now, I don't understand why that's a polymorphic character. I'm going to have to go rooting around to see why it wasn't just given a 1 if it's present. I don't know, but it did strike me as odd. And then the last character, where they're different, is on the dentary shape of the anterior edge in lateral view. It has a chin process protruding beyond the dentary tooth, which is Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. And while the dentary tooth 1 being anterior-most point is what they scored for mirabilis. So we'll put these images up. You can make your own decision on if you agree with those. I thought that was interesting. Now, what we see here is the vertebrae that they say exist in the cervical region. It looks like 3 cervicals. Because I say that is the very last one that they show, maybe 4. Let's call them 4 cervicals. Table S1 lists only a single partial cervical vertebra, and that is a mid one from Gen 2. I don't know if this line on here is pointing at D1 because it shows it's articulated with the last cervical, because I'm interpreting that as a cervical rib on the more anterior here, and then behind it as a dorsal rib. So that's my interpretation based on the figure and based on the morphology. But I'm not sure. They could be calling that dorsal 1. They do say from IGU 25, dorsal 1 and 2 were articulated with neural arch bases. This image certainly doesn't give me the neural arch bases, but then it'd be tough to see anyway. So here's a zoom in on that, and the morphology of this, is that a cervical rib or is that a dorsal rib? If we go by their table, then that's a dorsal rib. But morphologically, geez, I don't know. I'm going to say the parapophysis is coming up. It's still up on that centrum. I'm going to defer to the Spinosaur experts. Now let's zoom in on this one, because this one shows that spinal piece supposedly from Gen 2. Gen 2 does list a mid-posterior dorsal vertebrae, but it doesn't list a spine piece. And I wouldn't call this mid-posterior. I call it mid. It is number 7 out of 12. So I suppose that's just on the posterior side. Those generic, it's tough. I work in vertebrae. Those generic terms will drive you batty trying to figure them out. So if we zoom in on this piece here, it shows us from Gen 2. It does list that mid-posterior dorsal vertebrae, but I'd call this one a posterior dorsal. I mean, look at it. It's right in front of the ilium. This is the ultimate dorsal. This is the last dorsal vertebra. So I'm not matching these bones with the specimens. I wish they were labeled on there. This is good for me to see for future papers I write. And I'm going to label these things. I'm calling that a cervical rib here, and it's attached to that. But one may come back and tell me that this is actually they're calling the dorsal rib. So if you go with cervical, then that makes that the last cervical, and that's the first dorsal. And then you have this one over here, which would be the third rib. See what happens when you're trying to work with figures without the material? However, Gen 4 doesn't appear on the skeleton anywhere. So I think that anterior dorsal is Gen 7 for this D3. I think so. The end result is that's all we have. We've got a few tiny bits of postcrania right now to work with in the paper. And I can't do a lot with that from a comparative standpoint. I mean, they do identify 6 different characters, but I think 2 are variable. 1, I don't know how you do, and the other 3, maybe. They do make a conclusion that the sail and the tall crest were for visual display, visual signaling. And what's perplexing to me is if that statement is for Spinosaurus as a genus, and we've got other specimens, cool. But with the fragmentary information we have on this one, it seemed a bit of an overreach for just mirabilis based on the bones that I just showed you. One of the things they did note, similarities with Egyptiacus, was on the proximal end of the femur. They had a narrow anterior end and a hypertrophied fourth trochanter. Plus, they note the pedal phalanx is a low profile with reduced distal condyles, and those are similar to Egyptiacus, which was cool. They also noted other characters that made it similar to Egyptiacus. Advanced cervicalization. Not really sure how they determined that. Again, ignorance of theropods here. Broad proportions of the first dorsal centrum. Now, I know in sauropods, it's very difficult to tell dorsal 1 from the last cervical. Maybe it's cleaner in theropods. Presence of a trunk sail of unknown shape. I thought that was interesting, unknown shape. They know it had some kind of big sail thanks to a fragment. Unknown shape. Do they know something we don't? They note it has striated neural spines like Spinosaurus egyptiacus. They point out the anterior caudal neural spines have a cruciate cross-section. Cool. I saw that in the diagram. And the short mid-caudal centra have subquadrate articular faces. So those all link Egyptiacus to mirabilis. But again, to go over the differences, the relatively larger anterior dorsal pneumatic fossae, the proportionally longer tibia with an open, reduced medullary cavity, and those are pretty much the 2 big characters outside of those cranial elements. They say the holotype is about 8 meters long. They don't know how long mirabilis adult lengths get because everything they found was what they called subadult or immature. They were not full adults, which I thought was interesting. Most Spinosaurus egyptiacus material is not full adult either. So they claim that mirabilis is 15% smaller than the neotype subadult of Egyptiacus. They never state an adult estimated mass anywhere in the paper. They just present the 7-ton figure as it represents Spinosaurus generally. The paper cites the 7-ton mass for a teenage Spinosaurus. It uses an adult as its size standard in the figures. The 7-ton number is probably real, but it feels conflationary to talk about adult Spinosaur but never talk about the adult Spinosaur weight. They write, the length of the tibia relative to the dentary is greater in mirabilis than in Egyptiacus, suggesting hind length was slightly greater in mirabilis. I presume the tibia from Gen 4 and the dentary from Gen 4 belong to the same subadult individual. So then it made me wonder, well, what ontogenetic stages are they comparing in the Egyptiacus material? I just don't know the literature. Table S4 lists relative axial skeleton length and lists specimens and papers that were provided. So now I'm going to have to dig through and look at the tibia dentary ratio since they don't list it for the other specimens, which would have been really helpful. One of the things that I didn't figure out was, where are these little sites? How far apart are they from one another? Is Gen 2 20 meters from Gen 3 or 4 hills over or 100 miles away? I don't know. And it doesn't say the proximity of all of the different localities, which would be helpful to know. So they're making an assumption that all these bones found at different sites belong to the same species. It's not a bad assumption, but I think of the Morrison where you've got half a dozen different theropods. So granted, you can usually identify them. So maybe that's what's going on here. Spinosaurus is very different from Carcharodontosaurus or any kind of a belosaur. Do we have a single Spinosaurus specimen that allows us to measure all of these? Do we have a skull and cervical vertebrae and a known hind limb from one individual? If not, did they scale these up? And how do we know what to scale them up to? So I was really confused by the Spinosaurus PCA components because it's not altogether clear. And they say that they measure these 7 characters, and they said that they scaled FSAC-KK-11888 up to MSNMV4047. But I assume they're assuming isometry, that it just directly scales and not some kind of allometry or differential scaling. Don't know. It's not altogether clear. But they do provide measurements on the Egyptiacus. They're using 2 specimens, blending them together to make one animal out of it. So I'm making a lot of assumptions there. They include 43 archosaurs. That's a lot of taxa. That's great. But I would love to see semi-aquatic animals. I mean, where's the hippo? Where's the river otter? Those are beautiful. You know, it was the pursuit predator and the platypus while we're thinking about cool animals. How about a tapir? Let's put them in the mix. I would love to see additional animals, as well as when I was down in Tucson, I saw Thalattosuchians. Let's go look at like something different and wild, like a Champsosaurus, a Metriorhynchosaur. Some of these seagoing marine crocodile-like bodies, and mix them in as well. But what I love about this paper is they've established the baseline. They tell you what figures to measure. So my team could go and add those in and see how it changes, if anything, the analysis. And we've done this before on the lit paper and other papers where we go and we take the results and then we just layer items on top of it. It's great fun. These kinds of papers where they clearly lay out their methodology are deeply appreciated by me. I truly, truly love them. So I don't know. My biggest concern about the PCA was the big assumptions that went into it. But assuming the assumptions are right, well, then the outcome's going to be all right. And I mean no disrespect for any of the paper itself, because it is fantastic in the imagery that they did provide. And it's a tour de force with the videos and the artistry. It's really designed to capture the public's imagination. I made a tweet on it and it had 616,000 views. What? More than I think all of my tweets views combined. So people love them some Spinosaurus. I'm Dr. Brian Curtis of Fossil Crates saying, I hope you got my new book. I co-wrote with Colin Boisvert. It's absolutely fantastic. And if you did, great. If not, order from the website. Otherwise, thank you kindly. Adios.